August 29th, 1943. The Mediterranean Sea. Beneath the orange haze of a dying sunset, a formation of Junkers Ju-88 bombers carved across the horizon, their engines droning like distant thunder. Below them, the British cruiser HMS Uganda sliced through the calm water, her crew unaware that history's first precision-guided bomb was already gliding silently toward them. A pale gray wing, unpowered, unseen, descending faster than gravity itself. Inside one of those bombers, Oberleutnant Hans Dietrich Mertens held his breath. He wasn't carrying a normal bomb. No engines, no propeller. Just what his comrades mockingly called das Papierflugzeug, the paper plane. At 17,000 feet, his radio operator whispered, "Target locked, releasing." Mertens flipped the switch. The glide began. What the British saw next made no sense. A bomb that turned mid-air, followed its target, and struck with surgical precision. What happened next changed everything. Hans Dietrich Mertens was 28 years old, a former aeronautical student from Dresden who had joined the Luftwaffe not out of ideology, but fascination. Machines that flew. That was his devotion. He had studied the mathematics of lift and drag long before the world descended into chaos. When war came, his professors were drafted into weapons research, and Mertens found himself in uniform, not in a classroom. By 1943, the war in Europe was no longer going Germany's way. The Allies had invaded Sicily, and British naval task forces dominated the Mediterranean. The Luftwaffe's once feared bomber fleets were now outnumbered, outgunned, and, most importantly, outranged. Bombers sent to attack ships rarely returned. Anti-aircraft fire shredded them before they reached effective range. Dive bombers had to get dangerously close. Torpedo planes were massacred by fighter screens. But deep inside Germany, at a secret test base near Peenemünde West, engineers had been working on something so radical that even experienced pilots dismissed it as nonsense, a glide bomb that could steer itself. It was officially called the Fritz X, or FX-1400, the world's first precision-guided anti-ship weapon. To the engineers, it was a miracle of physics. A 3,450-pound bomb with stubby wings, a radio receiver, and tail fins controlled remotely by a joystick in the mother aircraft. The pilot could actually guide it after release, adjusting its descent using radio commands. But to the air crews, it was madness. A remote-controlled bomb? In the chaos of combat? They joked it would be like trying to land a paper plane in a hurricane. Mertens wasn't laughing. He'd seen the prototype tested over the Baltic, watching the bomb slice through clouds and hit a target barge dead center from 5 miles away. That precision, that defiance of chance, haunted him. He volunteered for the operational trials in the Mediterranean, assigned to Kampfgeschwader 100, the Luftwaffe's elite test wing. Their mission was simple but suicidal. Use the new weapon in real combat for the first time. No one expected it to work. The engineers called it innovation. The pilots called it suicide. But Mertens, adjusting his flight goggles and glancing at the photograph of his wife tucked into the cockpit frame, whispered a quiet prayer. If this paper plane worked, it would rewrite the laws of naval warfare. By mid-1943, the Mediterranean had become a graveyard for German air crews. Every attempt to strike Allied convoys ended the same way. Burning wrecks spiraling into the sea, black smoke curling into the hot Sicilian air. The Royal Navy's anti-aircraft defenses were now almost impenetrable. Each cruiser bristled with 40mm Bofors guns and radar-guided fire control systems that could track an incoming aircraft from miles away. To reach a ship meant flying through a wall of steel. The Luftwaffe had tried everything: Stukas diving from the sun, torpedo bombers skimming at wave-top level, high-altitude level bombing at night. Nothing worked. Even the best pilots admitted that accuracy against a moving ship was a fantasy. Instructors taught that, statistically, one bomb in 200 would hit a warship. That ratio was fine when Germany controlled the skies. But now, every failed attack meant dozens of dead airmen. Mertens had seen it firsthand. 2 weeks before his fateful mission, his friend and wingman, Lieutenant Werner Kahl, had been shot down over Salerno. They'd been assigned to attack an Allied convoy. Werner's plane never made it past the flak screen. Mertens had listened helplessly to the radio crackle. Hit, losing altitude, before the transmission cut off. When he returned to base, the hangar was quiet. The crews were tired, their uniforms crusted with salt and oil, their eyes hollow. They'd all lost someone. Mertens stared at the chalkboard on the wall, the one where every squadron wrote the number of aircraft that took off and how many came back. The right-hand column was getting smaller every day. That night, he'd overheard the engineers from Peenemünde arguing in the mess hall. "The problem isn't courage," one said. "It's physics." A bomber could drop a 1,000-kilogram bomb perfectly, and it would still miss, because the world below refused to stand still. Ships moved. Wind shifted. Flak forced pilots to jink and dodge. Human reflexes were too slow. But what if the bomb could think after it was released? That was the madness of the Fritz X. The control system was crude, a radio link that sent 4 basic signals: up, down, left, right. The bombardier had to track the falling bomb visually, using a flare in its tail, while steering it via joystick. The mother aircraft had to fly straight and level during this entire process. A suicide move under anti-aircraft fire. One wrong twitch, and the bomb was lost. One radio interruption, and it became useless. It wasn't foolproof, but it was revolutionary. Still, the Luftwaffe brass didn't trust it. They'd buried the project in secrecy, too afraid of ridicule to announce it. When word leaked that a steerable bomb was being tested, some pilots laughed openly. Others refused to carry it, saying it was a waste of precious flight hours. But in Sicily and Salerno, the pressure was mounting. The Allies were advancing north, their fleet untouchable, and Berlin demanded a miracle. That miracle now sat bolted under Mertens's bomber, a gray metal glider with control fins shaped like a child's toy airplane. As the ground crews loaded it, one mechanic muttered under his breath, "You're risking your life for a toy." Mertens just nodded. He had no illusions left. He'd watched enough friends vanish into the sea to know that sometimes the difference between genius and desperation was just a thin line of radio signal in the sky. That evening, before takeoff, he studied the mission briefing one last time. Target: Allied cruiser group south of Sardinia. Altitude: 17,000 feet. Payload: 1 Fritz X bomb. He closed his eyes and exhaled. Tomorrow, they would find out if the paper plane could really change the war, or if it would simply claim another crew. The night before the mission, the base at Istres was quiet, except for the distant whine of engines being tuned. Mertens sat alone in the operations tent, the light from a single lantern flickering across the flight charts. In front of him lay a diagram of the Fritz X: 4 narrow wings, a blunt nose cone, and a fragile tail assembly. It didn't look like a weapon. It looked like an experiment that had escaped from a university lab. He ran his finger along the pencil lines marking its radio control system. The transmitter in the Ju-88's belly, the receiver inside the bomb's tail. the servo motors that would tilt the control fins. He knew the system's limits. 10 seconds of clean signal before atmospheric interference, 15 at best. After that, the radio waves could scatter, bounce, or fade. The engineers had warned him, "You'll have to guide it by hand, like flying a model glider into a hurricane." At 3 o'clock, he walked out onto the tarmac. The air smelled of salt and petrol. The Fritz X hung beneath his bomber like a sleeping monster, unpowered, silent, waiting. Mechanics tightened the shackles and connected the cables. One of them, an older man with grease on his face, handed Mertens a small screwdriver. "Just in case," he said softly. The last crew said the receiver plug rattled loose from vibration. Mertens tucked it into his flight jacket. At briefing, their commanding officer from Kampfgeschwader 100 spoke bluntly. "Gentlemen, the Allies think they're safe. Today, we prove them wrong. You will climb to 17,000 feet, maintain radio lock, and deliver the weapon manually. You will not break formation until impact. Godspeed." By dawn, the bombers were airborne. The Mediterranean stretched below like hammered glass, silver blue in the morning light. Mertens flew lead in a formation of 3 Ju-88s. His co-pilot, Feldwebel Kruger, handled the instruments, while Mertens manned the joystick linked to the bomb's guidance system. "Target group spotted," the navigator announced. "Bearing 210, range 20 miles, British cruisers, heading northeast." Mertens glanced out the window. Tiny white wakes cut through the sea far below. The enemy fleet, oblivious to what was coming. "Approaching release altitude," Kruger said. Mertens's throat was dry. He reached for the joystick mounted beside his seat, a small, unimpressive control, no larger than a telegraph lever. His thumb hovered over the activation switch. "Bomb armed," came the voice from the bombardier. "Radio link stable." Mertens hesitated. If he failed, he'd prove everyone right. That this was a fantasy, a waste of men and machines. If it worked, it would rewrite what it meant to strike from the air. Releasing in 3, 2, 1. He flipped the switch. The aircraft jolted as the Fritz X dropped free. Mertens leaned forward, eyes locked on the glowing tracer in the bomb's tail. It fell, slicing through the thin air, its wings glinting in the sunlight like a bird's. "Control link steady," the radio operator murmured. Mertens gripped the joystick and tilted it gently left. Far below, the bomb obeyed, not perfectly, but enough. It banked toward the lead cruiser's wake. Flak erupted from the ships almost instantly, black puffs of smoke clawing upward. The first bursts were wide, the second closer. Kruger's knuckles whitened on the controls. "They've spotted us." "Hold steady," Mertens said quietly. Each second stretched into eternity. The bomb swayed, correcting itself, its flare flickering against the morning haze. 6 seconds to impact," the bombardier called. Mertens adjusted right, then down. The last correction. The bomb steadied, locked on. He whispered, almost to himself, "Fly true." And then the tracer disappeared into a column of water and fire. The blast hit them seconds later, a rolling shock wave that rattled every rivet in the cockpit. Kruger turned, eyes wide. "Direct hit." Mertens didn't answer. He just stared out the window as the white wake of the British cruiser twisted, slowed, and began to burn. The first moments after impact were disbelief, even for the men who had caused it. Through his cockpit window, Mertens saw the water bloom upward in a white column nearly twice the height of the cruiser. A second later came the muffled concussion through the fuselage, the sound of steel being torn apart underwater. "Target struck amidships," the bombardier shouted, his voice shaking. Below, the HMS Uganda staggered as if punched by an invisible giant. Sailors scrambled across her deck, smoke pouring from the ruptured midsection. What no one knew yet was that the Fritz X had not exploded on the surface. It had pierced the cruiser's armored deck, drilled deep into the machinery spaces, and detonated beneath the keel. A conventional bomb might have scorched the paint. This one broke her spine. Inside Uganda's operations room, alarms screamed. Compartments flooded instantly, lights flickered, and men were thrown against the bulkheads. "We've been hit below the armor," one officer yelled. Damage control teams rushed toward the breach, wading through waist-deep water already rising through the passageways. Above them, Mertens's bomber banked hard left, climbing for altitude. The flak fire intensified. The British gunners had found their range now, and black bursts bracketed the aircraft like thunderclouds. Shrapnel clattered against the fuselage. One burst shattered the glass in the dorsal gunner's canopy. Kruger shouted, "Two engines showing high temperature!" "Keep climbing," Mertens ordered, voice calm, almost detached. He couldn't look away from the scene below. The Uganda was listing badly to port, her aft turret submerged, her crew fighting fires that seemed to spread faster than they could be contained. Then, another flash from one of the other Ju-88s in their formation. The second bomber had released its own Fritz X, and Mertens watched as it curved gently through the air, turning toward its target like something alive. It struck another ship, an escort destroyer, snapping its back in two. For the British sailors watching from the decks, it made no sense. Bombs didn't steer. Bombs didn't correct their path. One gunner on the Uganda later wrote in his log, "It came down at an angle, then changed direction." Like it had eyes, Mertens heard the jubilation over the radio. "Direct hit! She's burning!" followed by a crackle of static. Then, silence. The third Ju-88 never came back. Caught in the flak barrage, it vanished into the sea in a plume of black smoke. Mertens's formation was down to two. They turned north, engines straining, every gauge trembling. The Mediterranean stretched endless below them, blue, merciless, filled with wreckage and oil slicks. At 12,000 feet, the crew finally exhaled. Kruger reached into his pocket and pulled out a cigarette with shaking hands. He laughed once, a hollow sound. "They'll never believe it," he said. "A glider. A flying bomb." Mertens said nothing. He just stared at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set, blood red over the sea. Hours later, after landing back at Istres, the airfield erupted in chaos. Mechanics, officers, and engineers crowded around the two returning bombers. Nobody cheered, nobody smiled. They were too stunned. Reports were already coming in by radio intercept. The British cruiser Uganda had been crippled. She was listing engines dead, her crew abandoning compartments to the fire. For the first time in the war, a guided weapon had sunk a major warship. That night, the mission log of Kampfgeschwader 100 recorded a single dry line. FX 1400 operational. Direct hit achieved on enemy cruiser. Return flight successful. But inside the officers' mess, it was different. The engineers from Peenemünde toasted with coffee mugs instead of champagne. "You've proven it," one of them told Mertens. "We just changed everything." He didn't feel like a hero. He felt numb. He thought about Werner Kahl, his friend who'd died 2 weeks earlier trying to hit a ship the old way. If only he'd lived long enough to see this. Across the sea, the British were in shock. Survivors from the Uganda were evacuated to Malta. 16 sailors were dead, dozens wounded. Naval Command reviewed the reports, struggling to explain how a bomb could strike so precisely from such altitude. Enemy weapon of new type. One intelligence memo read, "Glide or rocket assistance possible." They didn't yet realize they were witnessing the dawn of precision warfare, when human judgment and electronics began to merge. By midnight, the order came through Berlin. Every available Fritz X was to be deployed immediately. The age of dumb bombs had just ended. With a whisper, not a roar. The success over HMS Uganda spread through Luftwaffe channels like wildfire, though officially it was classified Geheime Kommandosache, top secret. No one outside Kampfgeschwader 100 was supposed to know. But word travels faster than orders, especially when lives are saved. By early September 1943, pilots stationed in France, Italy, and even Norway were whispering about a miracle bomb, one that could steer through flak, find a ship's weak point, and strike it dead center. Most dismissed it as rumor. Others, especially the veterans who had watched too many of their comrades die over the Mediterranean, clung to it like faith. The engineers at Peenemünde called the results encouraging. The British called them impossible. 2 weeks after the Uganda attack, the Allies would see the Fritz X again, and this time there was no mistaking it. September 9, 1943. Salerno Bay, Italy. The Italian government had just surrendered to the Allies. The Mediterranean was chaos. German forces retreating north, Italian crews switching allegiances overnight, and the Allied fleet anchoring close to shore to support the invasion. Dozens of warships clustered in the blue waters near Naples, guns aimed inland, and overhead, at 18,000 feet, KG-100 took position. This time, Mertens wasn't flying. His aircraft had been grounded for maintenance, so he watched from the runway as another crew, led by Captain Bernhard Jope, taxied down the strip with a Fritz X slung beneath the fuselage. Jope was a quiet man, a veteran of dozens of raids, steady hands, no ego. The kind of pilot the engineers trusted. Within hours, the world would know his name. At 16:28, Jope's bomber released its Fritz X over the Bay of Salerno. The target, the Italian battleship Roma, a 45,000-ton monster freshly surrendered to the Allies and now steaming toward Malta to join them. The bomb fell clean. Jope's bombardier guided it down, tiny corrections flickering through the radio link. The Fritz X curved in midair, invisible to radar, untrackable, unstoppable. It struck the Roma just aft of the forward turret, penetrated the deck armor, and exploded deep within the ammunition magazines. Witnesses saw the battleship erupt in a column of flame 500 meters high. A second Fritz X hit minutes later. The Roma broke apart and sank within half an hour, taking 1,393 men with her, one of the deadliest single strikes in naval history. The Italian fleet scattered. Allied commanders were speechless. Radio operators reported, "Unknown weapon, precision impact from extreme altitude." The British Admiralty called an emergency session. Within days, every Allied ship in the Mediterranean was ordered to change its anti-aircraft doctrine. Maintain constant evasive maneuvering, one directive read. Do not remain stationary under threat of high-altitude attack. The Fritz X had turned the sea into a sniper's range. From Malta to Gibraltar, fear spread faster than logic. Pilots who once dove recklessly at Allied ships now bragged about the ghost bomb that never missed. Back in Germany, the propaganda ministry smelled opportunity. They called it Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapon. Posters were drafted showing stylized bombs with wings striking Allied ships like lightning bolts. But the truth was more complex. Production was slow, training even slower. The radio guidance units were delicate, and each bomb required meticulous calibration. Only a handful of units in the entire Luftwaffe could operate them. Still, the effect on morale was electric. When Mertens returned to Peenemünde for debriefing, he found the test hangar crowded with new faces, young pilots eager to fly with the Fritz X, engineers scribbling notes on blackboards, and officers demanding faster results. The same men who'd once laughed at the paper plane now begged to carry it. He met the weapons chief engineer, Dr. Max Kramer, for the first time. Kramer was a soft-spoken physicist with ink-stained fingers, the kind of man who saw the war as a laboratory. He thanked Mertens quietly. "You proved it could work," he said. "Now they'll want hundreds, thousands, if they can." Mertens nodded, but said nothing. He had seen the Roma's wreckage photos. He didn't feel triumph, only unease. For him, the Fritz X was never about destruction. It was proof that human control could reach beyond the cockpit. That precision was possible where chaos had always ruled. But the high command didn't see nuance. They saw numbers. Every successful hit was another justification for more production, more missions, more targets. By October, Allied naval movements had changed entirely. Ships now zigzagged constantly, cut radio chatter, and deployed dense smoke screens whenever German bombers were spotted. All because of a 6-foot glider with no engine. For the first time since 1940, German aircrews felt they had a weapon the Allies couldn't match. And for the first time, Mertens wondered whether they had unleashed something that would outlive the war itself. When Mertens returned to his unit in late October 1943, the world had already changed. But not in the way Berlin had hoped. The Allies had adapted faster than the Germans anticipated. Every fleet now operated under constant motion doctrine, keeping ships in erratic patterns to throw off Fritz X targeting. Radar jammers were installed, new decoy flares were tested, and soon American engineers began experimenting with electronic countermeasures that could scramble the radio frequencies guiding the bomb. The miracle weapons reign had lasted barely 3 months. Mertens saw the shift firsthand. Missions that once ended in explosions now ended in confusion. The bombs drifted off target, lost signal mid-descent, or simply failed to respond. Some detonated harmlessly in open water. The Luftwaffe blamed operator error. The engineers blamed Allied interference. The truth lay somewhere in between. But for Mertens, the magic was already gone. The same officers who had ignored him before the Uganda attack now crowded him with questions, reports, and orders. He became a symbol, the quiet pilot who had guided history's first smart bomb. Peenemünde invited him for briefings, photographers asked for his portrait, and propaganda officers tried to script his interviews. He refused them all. "It was the engineers who built it," he said simply. "I just pulled a lever." Dr. Max Kramer, the physicist behind the design, was quietly transferred to the V-weapons program, where he would help refine the control systems later used in the V-2 rocket. He, too, avoided fame. "War," he once wrote in his journal, "is the only industry that forces science to grow faster than conscience." By spring 1944, the tide had turned entirely. Allied countermeasures reduced Fritz X effectiveness by over 80%. The Luftwaffe, short on fuel and pilots, could no longer sustain high-altitude bombing operations. Mertens's unit was reassigned to defensive sorties over northern France. The Fritz X faded into obscurity, a ghost weapon remembered only by those who had seen it work. When the war ended, Peenemünde was in ruins. The Americans arrived first, collecting whatever documents remained. Among them was a file labeled Fritz X Funkfernlenkbombe, radio-guided bomb. The file was shipped to Washington, where engineers at Wright Field studied its design. Within 2 years, the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance was testing its own version, the ASMN-2 BAT, the first American radar-guided glide bomb. The future had arrived, wearing a German signature. Hans Dietrich Mertens survived the war. Captured by British forces in 1945, he spent 2 years in a POW camp near Yorkshire. When interrogators asked about the Fritz X, he answered plainly, "It worked because we cared more about the problem than the rules." He returned to Germany in 1947, a civilian with no medals, no rank, and no pride left in the war he had fought. He found work as a mechanical engineer in Hamburg, repairing ships instead of sinking them. On his office wall, he kept a single photograph, a Ju-88 in flight, a thin white streak falling beneath it, vanishing into the clouds. He never spoke publicly about the Fritz X again. In 1962, when journalists covering Cold War weapons rediscovered his name, they tried to contact him. He declined every interview. "It wasn't invention," he wrote in one brief letter. "It was desperation made clever." When he died in 1980, there was no obituary, no official recognition, no monument, but his legacy lived on in every guided weapon that followed. From the precision bombs of Vietnam to the GPS-guided missiles of the modern age, the paper plane that once sank a cruiser had quietly fathered the entire age of smart warfare, and the man who proved it possible was content to be forgotten. History rarely remembers the quiet innovators, the mechanics, the engineers, the test pilots who gamble everything on a single idea. Hans Dietrich Mertens wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't lead armies or design grand strategies. He was just a man who looked at the impossible and refused to accept it. The Fritz X was born from desperation, from a war losing its certainty, from men watching the limits of courage meet the limits of physics. And yet, in that fragile glider bomb, part metal, part mathematics, lay the seed of an idea that would shape every battlefield that followed. Precision, control. The dream that even in chaos, human will could still steer the fall. Today, every laser-guided weapon, every drone strike, every surgical bombing owes something to that single paper plane that fell through the Mediterranean sky in 1943. It wasn't just a bomb. It was the moment humanity learned that distance no longer protected anyone. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more forgotten stories of courage, innovation, and the quiet minds that changed the course of history, one impossible idea at a time.